Hello, everybody. Welcome to another video. Today it is 21st of November, and today we're looking at critical updates beginning east of Velyka Novosilka, south of Andriivka, then looking at the Usmanivka pocket, Kursk, Pokrovsk, and Kursk will all be covered today, in addition to the Russian intermediate range ballistic missile strike towards Dnipro, targeting the Yuzmash industrial facility. As we zoom in, you'll see that the Russians have advanced really in a significant manner to the east of the city of Velyka Novosilka along a 19-kilometer wide front. You could see it over here with the ruler. The Russians were able to advance in particular in two areas. First off, 23.5 square kilometers to the southeast of the city, and this is through largely open areas that the Ukrainians lack the defensive capacity to hold on to because there are not many dugouts or organized trenches in these locations. So you have Russian armored columns or lighter vehicles dismounting Russian troops with little to no resistance on ground, although by air there were FPV strikes targeting those advancing Russian groupings. At the same time, you have a really important gain going on to the northwest of Yazda Poliana because the Russians are making this push, which is now expanded in the direction of Rozdolnya. It's about 6 kilometers away from where it was initially. Russians gaining control over 4 square kilometers of open fields on the road towards Rozdolnya, which is so critical because this village acts as a conduit between the wider Ukrainian defensive grouping in southern Donetsk. You have, of course, all of the Ukrainian defense nodes around Andriivka and its suburbs. Then you have the highways that run southwards and westwards, connecting to Velyka Novosilka, connecting to the Mokrieli River Valley. And then from there, it can expand northwards towards an area like Komar and the border between Dnipro and Donetsk. You also have several other highways in this region, including one that branches out from Oleksivka and then in a shorter manner reaches areas in the Mokrieli River Valley, most notably Komar. You have the highways that cross over rivers across the state boundary of Dnipro into Donetsk. And you just have a few other highways. But something that is of note is that this entire triad region between Donetsk, Dnipro, and Zaporozhye does lack in a intricate amount of highways. There are a few centralized ones, and the Russians are making use of that because they know that cutting off a couple of them will ensure that the Ukrainians lack the organized supplies needed to hold out in urban clusters like Velyka Novosilka. So the Russians are making this push northwards. They are looking to cut this specific road off. And as a result, the Ukrainians really their only route of escape would be along the river valley itself on the western side, on the western bank of it. Because if we are to zoom in over here, you'll see that there are also opportunities from Vermivka and from areas like Skudnie, Novi Komar to advance along the riverbank and then along this particular paved road towards Komar. But it is a narrow route. It is not as well built as some of the other ones, and it would be way too centralized, way too focused on one region where the Russians can concentrate all their fire. And that's really what the Russians are banking on over here. And their two-pronged attack from the east and from the south that would be able to squeeze the Ukrainians out and force them into this cauldron that would really have them decide between getting into a very fierce urban battle and potential encirclement or withdrawal. And that would be enough to tighten the noose and fully secure this urban center. And of course, it's helping the Russians the fact that they have control over a large majority of the higher elevated regions, largely in the fields, in the hinterlands between several of the villages that were taken over by the Russians over the past month and a half. So that would be, I suppose, north of this highway and then south of Shakhtarsk, south of Novokrainka, also in the regions surrounding Yazapoliana, these areas over here. You do have higher elevated hills that are overlooking roads, overlooking villages on the river valley, and overlooking Velyka Novosilka itself, which is, of course, square in the middle of the river. And it's completely understandable why its elevation is low. But then the Russians, of course, are going to take advantage of that for their own purposes of getting a vantage point and firing location towards those Ukrainian holdings. And so the Russians, over the next month or two, they are planning to shape the battlefield in a way that would allow them to then fully secure the city of Velyka Novosilka. And that would be a part of Russia's broader plan, broader scheme to ensure that full control over southern Donetsk that starts with Velyka Novosilka and also with Andriivka further to the north. And when continue along the river valley towards an area like Komar, which is so important because right now it acts as a conduit between the rear in Donetsk and the current line of contact. So that's something to keep in mind. And you will see how eventually the fronts in Velyka Novosilka and Andriivka collide as a result of the shared roads and shared rear bases in Komar. But for now, I do want to zoom in and look at the developments going on around Andriivka. So that would include the Uspanivka pockets. You could see that to the southwest of the town, the Russians advanced 39 hectares, generally around the same concentrated paved road that directly leads into Uspanivka. It is protected by this one important stronghold, which is really keeping the Russians at bay. But the majority of the pressure coming from the Russian side is not necessarily from the southern direction, the southern bank of the Sukhli Ali River. It's coming from the north. And that's completely understandable because there are vast swaths of fields that the Ukrainians simply lack the manpower and willingness to hold on to because they are so disconnected from the rest of the Ukrainian garrison here. So if you look at it at its farthest extent, the Ukrainians are currently located about 9 kilometers away from the corridor that would really allow them to leave this very, very narrow cauldron, which is connected through the intermediary of Uspanivka and then from there into Andriivka, Kurakova, etc. So it used to be even farther than that, even wider in this pocket. It would span as much as 13 kilometers, but those positions were just so disconnected. The chances of really being surrounded or being fired upon and isolated without any opportunity for exfil or so high. So any squads here, very small quantities of them were moved out, and the same thing could be said about the armored vehicles or the leopards that were operating in those areas. So the Russians are taking advantage of this and continuing to advance. Westwards, you have this advance of 6.66 square kilometers. Here, 1.04 square kilometer gain. Just continued advances, securing additional open fields, which has the importance of getting control over areas that could have been turned into fighting zones, whether it be through Ukrainians digging in tree lines or through leopards battling it out with Russian armored vehicles and tanks. It also means that the Russians are tightening the noose on certain settlements where you have the 79th Brigade located, like Yelizavetivka and Ilinka from the north. So not only will they have to stave off assaults coming directly from the east from Kateranivka or from the south from the 39th Motorized Rifle Brigade towards Yelizavetivka, but then also have tender pressure coming from the north. So that's all a part of the equation here. In addition, you have the Russians advancing around Dalnya. Here you have proof based on nearly 5 square kilometers of territory being captured by the Russian side, reports from the Ukrainians, and geolocations. So this is from the 21st of November. It's from the 102nd Regiment. I think it's from the 150th Division. That's the name of the brigade's division. You can see it over here. And it's accompanied by the 103rd Regiment. They are both involved in the Kurakova battles. So over the past 2 days, they've been able to secure 4.7 square kilometers, as we said. That includes the tree lines in some of the 2015 to 2022 trenches built on the perimeter of Kurakova that have been secured by the Russian side, measuring at most an advance of 4.5 kilometers westwards. Also, you had the agricultural facilities where the Ukrainians were trying to contest and drag out the fighting. The Russian forces, of course, by now you can see they were able to secure control of the residential areas and then expand westwards into those agricultural warehouses and raise their flag, confirming confident Russian control here, meaning the Russians have now a very solid salient of operations through which to expand, and that will be done for several reasons. First of all, it creates enormous strain and pressure onto the remaining Ukrainian battalions operating further to the south within the Uspanivka pockets because they have to worry about their northern flank. They have to worry about the Russians reaching this road over here and then cutting them off physically or at the very least through fire control, utilizing short range ATGMs or mortars or just direct fire onto any Ukrainian movement to and from this pocket. That is so critical. Additionally, having Dalnya over here, it provides the Russians with a very, very good hook from the south that really gives them an access to attack not just directly into Kurakova, as we're seeing in the eastern parts of the town, but also from the south to undermine the entirety of Ukraine's defense perimeter that was built over the course now of nearly 10 years. You could see it's over here. I'm going over with the red color, and all those regions would be now exposed because the Russian forces, they have now a very strong foothold in some of these trenches. A lot of them are connected together, so you have a very clear route through which to advance through an anti-tank ditch or through just generally a trench, and then push through that very, very narrow corridor westwards in a way that cannot really be fully repelled by the Ukrainians because of their focus on other sectors like the defense of Krakow or the defense of Uspanivka. And so then the area in between may be lacking in enough troops to engage in those direct confrontations. So then you have this entire debacle where there could be potential exploitation gaps on the rear to the southwest of Krakow, which creates further issues for logistics and just for the broader cohesiveness of the Ukrainian front line in these areas. And then from there, you could have the southern attacks coming on to the center of Krakow towards Pivdeni, into the industrial part of the city, towards residential areas in high-rise buildings. All of that is a part of the equation. And then from there, of course, looking further to the west at Andriivka. Additionally, here you have geolocation showing 1.5 square kilometers of territory being taken over by the Russians. They took over, again, additional fields in this southeastern section of the front line. They advanced along a key highway, which leads directly into the Pivdeni district. Again, a lot of high rise buildings in that particular area. The goal of the Russians now is to eliminate pockets of resistance because even though the Ukrainians were not able to put up a very strong defense in every single specific trench or specific tree line that appeared to be almost cordoned off by the Russian side. In this area, they are trying to do that, and it's completely understandable because it is really acting as a vanguard for the rest of the Ukrainian forces in the center of Kharkov because it is directly to the east. And any loss of this location would give the Russians, this direct access towards the center of Kharkov across an even broader front of several kilometers. So the Ukrainians that are located here, they're acting as a sort of vanguard to push back the Russian forces, either through those same tree lines or through the agricultural facilities. And so now it's imperative that the Russians capture those particular locations. Now, looking further to the north, we're going to zoom in on Pokrovsk. You're going to see that over here. The Russian forces have continued to advance west of Selidove, most notably towards Pustinka and towards just generally the E50 highway, pushing around the third to last line of defense before reaching the center of Pokrovsk. Here you can see that northeast of Pustinka, there was a gradual Russian advance. Again, some of the battalions that have been forced to regroup, they're doing so around here. So there is going to be that initial level of resistance from the Ukrainian side as the Russians continue to press and have not stopped, even though they have been able to secure Selidove and the vast majority of the villages located directly to the west, which could have been turned into a new status quo defense line. The Russians were understanding of the Ukrainian hopes and ensured that that would never come into existence. And now they're focusing on the last vestige of that, which would be through Pustinka. So now there's just a preparation going on across three different axes towards this one village. So it is in a very tricky situation near that line of contact. You also have just a gradual Russian gain along the E50 highway, which is going to be critical for further Russian operations. They're currently in the process, the Russians, of garnering additional control of the various open fields, probably spanning 5 kilometers north to south between the E50 highway and between Petrivka, Hrihorivka, and then the suburbs of Pokrovsk and the small villages that are supposed to protect its southern flank. Of course, most notably Shevchenko, it's a very important one, but there's a few other ones here that you can see me going over with the red color. And the Russians are now in the process of getting control of all of those open fields to the south. 68th Jaeger Brigade is responsible for spotting those Russian soldiers, targeting them with grenade drops or FPV strikes. And again, the Russian side, they want to do this in order to diversify the vectors of attack, not just have it from the east, but in order to spread out, further thin the Ukrainian defense line over here, find weak points, which could be along the rail line, for instance, along the windbreaks. It could be through a village like Lasivka, which is currently, it's not currently fully under Ukrainian control. It's actually contested. Or it could be along a highway, for instance, where armored vehicles would have a clear route to advance north through. But again, this region is not the most priority for the Russian side. It's more so focusing on areas of Kharkov, Uspanivka, and the like. Now, to look at the situation in Kursk, this is finally being admitted by Ukrainian sources, including Deep State and Petrenko, but it is that the Russians secured control over a really important Ukrainian salient that for months now has been badgering Olgovka, Kremyannoy, Krenovo. Now, all of that pressure directly onto those villages has been alleviated, and the front line has stabilized along a line that is, much more condensed for the Ukrainian side. It also means that they can concentrate their forces in this corridor region between Leonidovo and Malaya Luknaya without the fear of, having as severe of a cutting off by the Russian side. But on the other hand, it means they've lost any ability to, in the future, exert pressure onto Russian staging points in Kuranovo. So for now, the Ukrainians are completely within the mindsets of retaining control over whatever, what they have left in the Kursk location. As the Russians continue to advance. So the Russians really, they spent the past 2 weeks engaged in fierce clashes to get control over this yellow polygon. It did not happen overnight, but now the Ukrainian side is admitting to it. So in terms of the advance and its fullest extent, it would be nearly 10 kilometers west to east, which is really a large amount. It includes gully regions, ditches, open fields, forested areas like these ones that I'm going over with my cursor, really massive locations. And you can see how all of the outskirts of Kremyannoy are now cleared. The Russians have been able to secure them. I would be interested to see if there's any, prominent videos that will be published about POWs being taken or ground and ground clashes with whatever Ukrainian squads were remaining here and trying to ensure that the rest of the Ukrainian garrison could retreat and regroup around the remaining villages within, I suppose, the northern section of the Kursk front. So that's all important to note. But when it comes to the Russian situation, now they're going to be able to alleviate a lot of pressure onto some previously very, very contested locations. Now they're going to turn into staging grounds for future Russian attacks that can now come from the western axis. They can come from this location over here, in addition to north to south attacks coming from the highway, coming from the paved road in the direction of Pogrebki, Novaya, Sorochina, etc. You could also have the push come along these forested regions towards Krugelenkoy and then into the western sections of Malaya Luknaya. That is now a very significant possibility as a result of the Russian gains here, which, again, as we said before, occurred over the process of 2 weeks, but now give the Russians a very localized advantage as the Ukrainians try to regroup with their forces from the 1st Heavy Mechanized Brigade, air assault elements like the 88th, 82nd, 95th Brigades, territorial defense units that are defending in regions slightly further to the south, like the 103rd here, Territorial Defense Brigade, but you have the 129th as an example, and a few other notable units like the 41st Mechanized. So they're all deeply engaged with the current clashes as the Russians from the 810th Brigade, they're the ones largely doing the operations in Pogrebki. And I think 51st VDV Regiment has a large role with the fighting in Novo Ivanovka, for instance, coupled with the 155th Marine Brigade as an example. And there was just a few other examples of units like the 104th Assault Regiment, 137th Airborne Regiment as another example. So they're all operating within this framework. Now, moving to the by now infamous Russian strike towards Dnipro. It was launched, according to Ukrainian sources, from Astrakhan, that is located over here, very close to the border with Kazakhstan. And I want to measure its distance towards Dnipro. It is about 1,000 kilometers away, so well within comfort for the launch of such a IRBM. So that would be an intermediate range ballistic missile in this case, because it's not over 5,500 kilometers in range. That would be the classification for an ICBM. An IRBM would be between 3,000 to 5,500 kilometers. And in this case, with the specific IRBM used, which is a new one and it had not been heard of previously, the Oleshnik, it is reported to have a range of 5,000 kilometers. And I can't confirm that as of yet, but it is very interesting to see for the first time the utilization of this ballistic missile, which in the video footage, because there's been a lot posted, mainly security camera footage from apartments in Dnipro, showing the damage, showing the strikes actually. And then in the morning, once the dust settled, you had emergency crews coming in to just clear up the fires because they reported that within the Yuzmash plant, which is the name of the facility struck by the Russian side, there were 9 garages struck, but it was like, in terms of human casualties, it was only 2 wounded, so not anything large. Nobody was there at the time. You had footage of 6 multiple independently targetable re-entry vehicles falling from back from the atmosphere towards the locations in the Yuzhmash plant, which is a really large facility. I think it's like almost 3 square kilometers. So when you see it fall in so many different locations, that is still within the confines probably of the industrial facility and could cause theoretically, depending on the submunition, wide scale damage. Now, with each wave of MIRVs that end up striking the Yuzhmash plant, each one had around 6 submunitions. So you had in total 36 submunitions fall towards the industrial facility within just one missile being launched. This is the first time that the IRBM has actually been utilized by the Russian side. They're testing out, of course. The Pentagon says that it is a part of a wider program taken from the Rubej ballistic missiles. Those ones were actually intercontinental ballistic missiles. So a lot of the components and the technology was inspired from that, in addition to more generally having links to the R-30 Bulava submarine launched ballistic missiles. So they were created with similar technology. Also, very similar to, for instance, the Topol M and the Yars intercontinental ballistic missiles. So, really is a synthesis in some ways of those systems, but with a shorter range. And of course, in this case, it was using a conventional warhead. The Oreshkin definitely has a smaller diameter than the Rubej ICBMs. And also, of course, the Rubej has a range of 5,800 kilometers, which would put it slightly over the classification for being an ICBM. Putin said during his speech that the Oreshkin has a speed 10 times the speed of sound, and that it would translate to between 2.5 to 3 kilometers per second, but I saw some people say it was 3.5, so I'm not exactly sure. And again, at those speeds with the quantity of submunitions and reentry vehicles at the same time, it is a clear show of capabilities that any sort of uh, Western air defense system will not be able to intercept it if the Russians so choose to utilize it any time again in the future. Putin, during his speech, said that the Oreshnik was being tested in this operation and that it has achieved its objectives in that test. And the Russians are working on building up a large stockpile of short range and medium range ballistic missiles in response to the United States planning to deploy such systems within Europe or in East Asia. They talked about Putin in his speech talked about the potential to strike Ukraine again with similar systems, similar IRBMs with conventional warheads, of course, and that due to the inability of any sort of air defense system to intercept at those sort of hypersonic speeds, and they would give previous warnings to any citizens nearby those targets before they were to be struck. If the Russians ended up taking that sort of course of action, and they would also warn what he referred to as friendly countries about those sort of actions before they were to be conducted. And so, actually, before the strike on the industrial plant in Dnipro, about 30 minutes before, Putin actually informed the United States of his intentions to strike over here, and Ukraine was, of course, notified. But there's not much you can do about that sort of notification. It's more so just an opportunity for people to evacuate from the area. And a lot of it has been cordoned off since, like with the SBU operating there. And so we can't get a full idea of the damage that was caused. But I will say that regardless of what happened today, between 5 to 7 a.m. today, this location, the Yuzhno, the plant, is really, really important because it used to serve as a central hub for the ICBM production of the Soviet Union ever since it has been turned into a ballistic missiles production facility for the Ukrainian side, where they create the Grom 2s, for instance. The Ukrainian produce short range ballistic missiles. They also create here long range UAVs. There's plans to create Leopard repair facilities in this area, and more generally, just stockpiles of repairing for equipment, ammunition, etc. In addition to all of the normal civilian, industrial output that comes out of this wider system of various industries in Dnipro itself. So all of that is important to note. And Putin also spoke to the strikes that occurred on the Ukrainian side towards Russia, whether it be in Bryansk or in Kursk. So we talked about how you had, of course, the 6 ATACMS being launched towards Bryansk, and that uh, Putin made sure to emphasize that the ATACMS were American produced, and that one of them actually ended up having some sort of impact onto the facility in Bryansk, causing what he said is minimal damage, and that the fires have already been extinguished without casualties. Then with the Storm Shadows, he didn't say this in his speech, but the Russian MOD, they claimed to have intercepted 2 Storm Shadow missiles, cruise missiles, and also GMLRS rockets during the attack. It wasn't specified whether or not it was in relation to the attack on Kursk, but you could put 2 and 2 together and assume it was. And so then, based on the reporting of the amount of missiles that were launched at the same time in the footage that we saw, it would be 2 intercepted out of 12. And Putin said that there were casualties, that there were people that were killed in that strike, the strike with the Storm Shadows onto Kursk. And he said that they were external security and support staff. He says that they were not a part of the command and operational staff of the command post, basically admitting that there was actually a high profile command post located in this area, which has been targeted several times by the Ukrainian side. And he did not discuss in general the numbers, but on the Ukrainian side, they talk about 18 being killed, 33 injured, and this is where it gets controversial and very, very unconfirmed. But they say that there were 3 North Koreans wounded in the strike. There was a Wall Street Journal article claiming that a North Korean general was wounded in the strike, and that would be the first time that they actually commented on a North Korean casualty Western source. But again, we're hearing all of these unconfirmed and unnamed sources, and there's always an interest behind unnamed officials coming forward to tell the media a certain thing. It could be media framing, it could actually be accurate. So we don't really have a way of knowing until we get independent verification of North Korean soldiers or generals located in these areas. But that's all I have for today. So